Well guys, we're going to today work on our 1221 single pole switch lab using EMT conduit. So for our lab today we're going to need a few things. We're going to need our tester and our lock and our tag for sure. Safety again, we'll have to make sure that we do our safety. Then we're going to need an octagon box for the light in the ceiling. And this octagon box has no straps inside of it. So this is the 54151K box. There's no straps inside the box. Okay, and then the other box that we need is going to be a 4x4 box. It's going to house our switch. And then on top of that, when we put it in, we're going to put a plaster ring on there. It just reduces it down to a single pole, to a single gang box that we can put in our single pole switch. We're going to need some straps to strap our conduit. We're going to need some screws to fasten our boxes and to fasten our conduit on. We're going to need a breaker for the panel. For our EMT conduit, we're going to need an EMT half-inch connector. We're going to need some tools. The tools that we're going to need, we're going to need a set of crimps for our stake-on connectors for the end of our stranded wire, because we cannot put stranded wire around the screw, so we have to tin the end, or we have to put stake-on connectors on the end so that we can connect properly to our terminal screws on our single pole switch. We're going to need a reamer to clean out the end of our conduits. Once we cut this conduit, it's going to cause some ridges inside our conduit, and we need to ream that out so that we get rid of all those burrs and fins inside that conduit so that we don't damage our wires when we draw them into the conduit. We're going to need a level because we want to make sure everything that we do is nice and straight and neat and level. Of course, we're going to need our tools, our screwdrivers, and your pliers and all that stuff that you might need as you go on to do the lab. So make sure that you got your tools. Plastic keyless with your lamp for in the ceiling. We're going to need a tape measure and a Sharpie. I know that in the shop here we're going to use a Sharpie, but on the job site we would probably use a pencil or something to mark the conduit for our measurements. That's not going to stay on it, it's not going to be permanent. But for our lessons in our labs in here, we'll use a Sharpie so that we can see the mark very easily. Again, we're going to need a bender. We're going to need a half-inch bender. And I think, and a hacksaw too. We need a hacksaw, so we need something to cut our conduits. So let's get started on our lab. And then we have our level. So let's get started on our lab. We're going to go over to the workstation there, and we're going to do our lockout tagout test, because that's very important that we make sure that everything off is safe when we work in a panel. So we'll do that, and then we're going to get started on our lab, and we'll work our way through it, explaining how we need to get that done. So in our workstation, again, we're at our panel. We're going to make sure that our breaker is off. I'm going to take the cover off our panel, put it aside. We're going to take our tester. Again, we're going to put it on voltage. Voltage, again, is the V with the wavy line over top for the AC voltage. We're going to take our tester and we're going to take it to a known outlet. We're going to make sure that our tester works properly. It gives us our proper reading. Once we know and are sure that our tester works properly, we're going to take our tester and we're going to test from our ground bar to our neutral bar. And then we're going to test from our neutral bar to line 1. And then we're going to test to line 2. Then we're going to move our lead to our neutral bar. We're going to go from line 2 to the neutral, line 1 to the neutral, and then we're going to go from line 1 to line 2. And seeing that our panel is dead and we're safe to work on it, then we're going to take our lock and our tag, and we're going to put our lock and our tag on the panel. Again, make sure you take the key out and put it in your pocket. Don't leave it in the lock.
Go.
Okay, so we're going to mount our boxes first. We're going to mount our 4x4 box on here, and then we're going to mount our octagon box on the ceiling. So in our lab, it says that our box has to be 3 foot 8 inches. 3 foot 8 inches, which is 44 inches to the top of the box. So we're going to mark that, 44 inches. And it says that it's going to be 4 inches from the outside of our plywood, so we're going to mark that. So our box is going to go right in this corner here, and we're going to mount that first. So to ensure that our box is level, we're going to take our level, we're going to set it on the top of the box. Make sure that it's level. And again, mostly the conduit work that you do is going to be surface mounted. It's going to be visible to your customers. So we want to make sure that every time we install conduit and boxes that they're level. So a good thing in your toolbox, in your thing is a good level with a magnet on it. It'll stay to the side of your conduit. When you go to put your conduit in, it'll stick to the side of your boxes. Again, so that you can level stuff. All right, very important. All right, let's mount our octagon box in the ceiling. And again, we're going to do it surface mount. We'll take our octagon box, we're going to mount it up to the ceiling. Again, 2 screws is more than enough. We'll hold our box up. While I'm up here, I'm going to put my my connector in the box. And just one of the things when you put a connector in the box is there's a set screw on there that holds that conduit in there nice and tight. And we want to make sure our screw is and our connector's tight. But this screw on the end of that box, sometimes it will be in the way of our cover plate. So if it's on a bit of an angle, then it'll work better for you. And while we got this box mounted, we'll put the connectors in this one too. Again, make sure they're nice and tight. And then we'll put one in our panel. So when we go to put our connector in our panel, because our panel's inset into the wall, so it's a flush mount panel, and we have a 2x4 here in the way, so we're going to need to come outward a little bit with our conduit. So if we put our connector too close to this conduit, to this 2x4, we're not going to get our conduit around this. So let's put our connector back as far as we can in the panel. Again, we'll tighten that lock nut up and make sure that it's good and tight, because we need to make sure that our connectors are in our panels and in our boxes nice and tight, with the lock nuts nice and tight, because that's going to be our bond. That's going to ensure that we have a continuous bond throughout. So having them nice and tight will ensure that we have a good connection there. So now that we have our connectors in, we're going to start with our conduit. So we only need to come up about a foot from the top of the panel. We're going to build a 90. We're going to put a little kick on here, and then we're going to put a back-to-back 90 down onto our first connector here. When you measure this for a back-to-back 90, you've got to measure from the back side of the connector to the back side of the connector above on the panel. So we're going to measure that out, and we'll figure that out. We'll bend our conduit. So we're going to measure from the back side of our box, and it says 5 1/4 from the edge of that connector. And assuming that we have this plywood here mounted level, we can take and we can measure it across over to here, and I have 24 3/4 of an inch plus my 1/4 of an inch for here would give me 25, plus my 5 inches will give me 30 inches for my back-to-back 90. Okay, so here's my piece of conduit. I got it laid on the ground. We want to get into an area where we got a little bit of room to work. So I come out of the workstation here and I laid my conduit on the ground. So I talked about the conduit coming from my top of my panel up. So I sit about a foot. So I'm going to take my tape measure and I'm going to measure my foot. Then I'm going to measure back for my take-up on a 1/2 inch EMT bender. You can look on the side and it's going to tell you stub ups 5 inch to the arrow. So your take-up on this bender is 5 inches. From my foot measurement, I'm going to come back 5 inches. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to take and I'm going to make a complete circle on my conduit where I want my bends. So I'm going to bend my stub up. I'm going to make sure that I put my conduit and make sure that it's right on my arrow. And I'm going to pull it up. Make sure that your foot is on the pedal, and you're going to pull it up nice and easy, no jerking, just straight up. And your handle should be just about a 45. Your tape measure, bring your tape measure. If you want to make sure that it's a foot, and there it is. There's our 90. Now we said we had to build a back-to-back. So our back-to-back 90s is going to be on the arrow of our bender, or sorry, on the star of our bender. Well, I need to measure this edge here. So for me, the easiest way I do it is I take my bender, I lay my conduit up against my bender, then I can measure from my bender back. Remember I said it was 30 inches? So I'm going to, from my bender to 30 inches, that's where my bend is going to be. And again, that's where my bend is going to be. So I'm going to put a circle on that. So, we said that our take-up on our bender was 5 inches. So why we're going to use the star on here is because the star is approximately half of that shoe. So that's going to be 2.5 inches. And again, it's going to give us that back-to-back bend that we need. We're going to hook our conduit, make sure that our mark is right on the star. We're going to make sure our handle's nice and level, and we've got to make sure that this stub up is level with our bender, and everything is nice and even and straight before we make that pull, because once we do that, we don't want it twisted here, we don't want a dog leg in there, it's not going to work for us. And again, nice and level, easy bend, and that should be our conduit for from our panel to our box. Okay, back in our workstation here, I'm going to set my conduit into my connector on the panel. And again, I got a pretty good fit here. Okay, I need to get a kick into my conduit here. And when we talked about conduit earlier, and we talked about some shrink, when you change direction of that conduit, when you put a kick in there, you're going to lose a little bit. But because our kick is going to be very, very minimal, we're not going to lose enough that it's going to matter to our length of our back-to-back 90. Okay, so when I had my conduit up there, I marked where my 2x4 was going to be. So when I put this kick on there, again, I think I'm going to use my star on here because I want the bend to be right by my mark. So, and because the star is the back of the bend, do that. Again, if your conduit's laid on the floor, okay, so I'm going to put it on the star, my mark, and I'm going to put a little kick in it. And it doesn't take much, just a very, very little bit. Again, when your conduit laid on the ground, making sure that your bender is nice and straight and even 90 degrees with that conduit, so that when you do put this little kick on there, we're not going to put a dog leg in it. Okay, I'm going to try that. Just that little kick is all it needs. Okay, now that I have my kick on my conduit, I'm going to install it in my panel, and I'm going to take and I'm going to line it up with my connector here. I should be fairly level. I'm going to put my magnetic level on the top of my conduit, and then I'm going to bring this conduit down until it's level. Once I have it level, I'm going to take my Sharpie and I'm going to mark the top of the box on my conduit. And this is where I'm going to cut it off, and then that's going to fit into here. But once I get it cut off, I'm going to fit it to make sure that I'm correct, and then I'm going to put a small box offset on the end of my conduit here. But when I do that, what I like to do is take my Sharpie and mark the front of the conduit, so that when I go out to bend my conduit, I know this is the top of my conduit. So I got an orientation point on my conduit, so I know where to bend it. Okay, so now that we have our conduit marked, we need to cut it off. On the job site, most of the time, the only thing that you're going to have with you as far as to hold your conduit for you is a ladder. Okay, and I like to use my ladder as kind of as a little bit of a workbench. We set tools on it, and of course, I use it for cutting my conduit. Okay, so I usually take my conduit and I'll stick it across inside the ladder. My conduit's marked, and I'll put my mark fairly close to the rail of my ladder. Then I can take my hacksaw and I can cut my conduit. So there, my conduit's cut. And again, we talked about making sure that we get rid of all these fins and burrs inside this conduit. When we go to draw wire in this conduit, we don't want any sharps in there that's going to destroy or damage our coating or our insulation on our conductors. So again, we talked about our reamer tool. So we're going to take that reamer tool and we're going to just take it around, and we're just going to ream out the edge of the conduit. And this reaming tool reams not just the inside, but a little bit on the outside too. So it makes it nice and smooth, so we're not going to damage our conductors. But I would also make sure that when you're putting this conduit, even though this is a manufactured end, and usually there isn't any problems with that, it's usually fairly smooth, I usually just take my tool and I just make sure, and I'll go around and I'll just run my tool through there just to ensure that I don't have any problems. Okay, let's go and install this into our panel in our box. Okay, so we can put our conduit in the box. So I'm going to take and just dry fit it, just to make sure that I'm okay. And it looks good. So now what I'm going to do is we need to put this box offset on here. And again, like I said, we marked the front of our conduit so we know where the front of our conduit is. I'm going to take my conduit and I'm going to put it in my bender. I usually stick the conduit in the bender just so it pokes out the end of the bender just a little bit. Again, we want to make this offset, and we want to make sure that this conduit here is nice and level and even with our bender. We're just going to bend it a little bit. It's not even 10 degrees. It's just a little touch. And then we're going to take our conduit and we're going to turn it 180 degrees. Slide it in past our bend. Look down our conduit, making sure that we're nice and straight so that we don't put a dog leg in it. And again, it's just a little bend. Let's see how we made out. Down in, nice and in, and there's a nice box offset. Okay, so I'm going to throw a couple of straps on this conduit just to hold it in place. So I have some 1/2-inch EMT straps, some screws, and then just about a foot above the box I'm going to put a strap and hold it. One more at the top by my bend there. And there, my conduit's in and fastened good. Let's not forget to tighten up our screws. Okay, we're going to have to do our measurements. On this lab, I would measure from my octagon box in my ceiling to the wall. Then I would put my kick in until it matches and comes down nice and parallel with this conduit into our connector. Okay, so from our wall to my box is 30 inches. But my plywood here is 3/4, so I want to take about 3/4 of an inch off. So I'm going to take that measurement off, and I'm going to build my 90. I'm going to put a 90 on my conduit so it comes down the wall here first.
Go.
Okay, so I got my 90 in my conduit, so I'm going to take it up, and I'll make sure that it fits. Again, nice to just kind of dry fit everything first. So it's setting up there. So now I know I need to make a kick in my conduit. So I'm going to mark that conduit. So it's sitting there so I know. I'm going to put my kick about there in my conduit. Okay, so now I got my measurement mark. I'm going to take my bender and I'm going to make myself a little kick in the conduit. Again, I like to use the star, because that's kind of where the conduit bends on our bender, so that my kick is in the right area. So again, start very easily. Don't put a big kick in there because it's going to be difficult to take out. I know 1/2-inch EMT conduit, you can massage it a bit if you bend it a little too much and take it out. But if you get into the bigger conduits, it's very difficult to do that. So again, just start off with a little bend. So I'm going to start off with a little kick to start, and then I'm going to try and fit it. If it doesn't fit properly, then I'm going to come back out and I'm going to increase my kick. Okay, so now that I got my kick in my conduit, again, I like to dry fit it, make sure that I'm correct. Sometimes I get pretty lucky and it's fairly straight. So now that I got my conduit in here and I have it fit pretty good, what I'm going to do is I'm going to take my Sharpie, because of this kick turns this conduit so it changes where the front of this thing is. Now that I have my conduit in, dry fitted, I'm going to mark again the front of my conduit, and then I'm going to mark my conduit by the top of my box. Sorry you can't see that. I will get down off the ladder here. So again, I'm going to mark the top of my box, and then I'm going to mark the front again. And then we're going to cut our conduit off, and this is where my box offsets are going to go.
Go.
Okay, so now I got my conduit bent, and it should fit in there. Again, just a reminder, make sure that you take your reamer and ream out the end of these conduits. Make sure that there's no way that our conductors are going to be damaged when we pull them into our conduit. So now that I have my conduit bent, we still have these offsets to make. So I have my mark on my conduit, so I know that's the front. That's the front of my conduit. We always bend into the wall and then away from the wall, or into the ceiling, away from the ceiling. So the first bend is going to be with the line at the top of my bender. And again, it just put my finger on the end of the bender so I can feel the conduit just starting to poke out. And again, it's just a small little bend, very little. We're going to, again, turn it 180 degrees. We're going to look down our conduit and make sure that we're nice and straight. And we're just going to put another little bend in it. We got the other end to do. So again, we still have our mark on there. Make sure that our mark is right at the top of the conduit. And again, you need to make sure that you got enough area to work with. It's a little tight in this workstation here. Probably be better off if I was outside in the class. But again, our line's in the center of our bender, right in the center of our hook. It's just starting to poke out the end of my conduit. And again, I'm just going to put a little bend in it, just enough. Right? And then I'm going to take my conduit, I'm going to spin it around. And again, I'm going to look down my conduit, make sure that we're nice and straight with the bend that we previously put in there. And we're just going to put a little bend in there. So we have a nice little box offset. Then we can fit our conduit into our boxes. Nice box offset on the octagon box in the ceiling. Our bend, the kick, conduit's nice and parallel down into our box. Again, let's put some straps on there to hold it in place. And when you put the straps on, you should try and put them fairly level when you're running conduits parallel to each other. It just looks neat and a little bit more professional. Again, let's not forget to tighten up our set screws. And then one more up top on our box up. And now our conduit is fastened in. Okay, so now we got our conduit in, we can start pulling in our conductors. One of the things, we're going to use some T90 number 14 conductor. Again, make sure they're on a reel stand. We don't want to pull it off the end of the coils because it'll all coil up and it'll make it very difficult to pull into a conduit. Because we don't have any joints in our conduit, our wires should be in there, and it's fairly short, so our wires, we should be able to push them through the conduit fairly easily. If you were running longer conduit runs, we would tape these wires together if they were a 10-foot run maybe and shove them in. Otherwise, we'll use fish tapes to pull the wire in, or pull ropes, that kind of thing, to pull in if you have multi-conductors putting in. But for this lab, we only have 2 conductors. We don't need a bonding conductor, so we don't need an insulated green wire in our conduits, because our conduit is going to be our bond. Our conduit is going to be our bond. And that's why we want to ensure that our lock nuts are nice and tight on our connectors, ensure that we tighten up our set screws on our conduits so that we can ensure that we have a good bond. So I'm going to start at the panel, and I'm going to shove my conductors up through my conduit, feeding it in there. And it come out nice and easy at my box. So I'm going to just take a little bit, because I'm not going to cut this wire, because I know that I'm just going to leave enough at the box here so that I can make my connections later. So I'm going to take my 2 conductors again, my white and my colored, and I'll push that up. Until it comes out at my octagon box in the ceiling. Pull my conductors out. Make sure I got, 6 to 8 inches. It's my 150 to 200 millimeters of wire that I need to work with. I have a little extra wire here that I don't need, so I'm going to pull it back at my panel a little bit. So I'm going to pull my white back. But I'm going to leave a little bit of white in this box, just in case that we have to put more conduit in this box or make other connections. So right now, I'm just going to coil a little bit of white in the back. Again, I'm going to make sure that I got enough wire to connect to my switch. Then I'm going to cut my wire off at the panel here.
Go.
Okay, so I'm going to cut my wire off with the panel here, make sure that I got enough, again, to the bottom of my panel, maybe just a little bit longer. So I got enough to work inside my panel. Again, I'm just going to coil up my wire here to get it out of the way. Just so it's not going to be a problem, we're done with it. Okay, so I'm going to break my ungrounded conductor, my power conductor. There, and then I have my wire up top. Again, on the stranded wire, we cannot wrap it around the screw. So we're going to need to put some stake-ons on the end. In the panel, it's fine because we have lugs here so that we can press down onto the copper conductor, and again, it's not going to go away. The strands are not going to go out on us. On our switch, with the stranded conductors, when we go to put it around a terminal screw on our switch, we can get some free strands sticking out, and we don't want that. So what we're going to do is we're going to put some fork connectors on the end of our wires to hitch onto our switch. So we can do that. So we'll grab our strippers. Strip the end of our conductors, twist them up a little bit just to keep the strands together as best we can. Then we're going to put our solderless connectors. There's a bunch of different names for them. Stake-on, solderless connectors. You could, Conduit makes them. There's a lot of companies that make them. There's different color codes on them. So blue will work for number 14 wire, and then there's some red ones that are for some smaller wire, and there's some yellow ones that are for like size number 10 wire, that kind of thing. So they come in different sizes, and again, we're going to crimp them on the end. There's a tool that you use to crimp them on, to crimp on the end of your wires. Some of you guys in your tool belt, you have a pair of linesmen that has a little piece on the handle that is made for crimping on these solderless connectors. Okay, because we have a 4x4 box here, we need to reduce this down for our single pole switch. So we have a plaster ring, what we call a plaster ring, and then again, we're just going to put it on there, brings it down, and also on that plaster ring, it also has a measurement on here because of the extension that it sticks out. It gives us a little bit more area for box fill. So again, it sticks out a little bit. There's a number on here that you can add to for allowable box fill. We're going to take our cover. See if we can get it. Tighten it up with our Red Robertson screwdriver. Hitch our single pole switch to our conductors, and these are fork connectors, so they'll just slide right over top of our terminal screws. We'll use our green Robertson to tighten it up. And again, that device is done. I don't have to worry about strands sticking out from our connectors or around our screws. So it's good to use the stake-on connectors, or if you don't have stake-on connectors, you can use some solder and tin the end of the wires and put them around there too, so that we don't get any stray strands sticking out. Okay, now I'm going to do the octagon box in the ceiling. Twist up my strands here a bit so that it's easier to put my stake-on connector on the end. I just want to see when I put this stake-on the end, I just want to be able to see the strand just starting to stick out the end of that connector there, so that I know that it's all the way through. And again, making sure that I have a good connection. I'll get my plastic keyless. And again, on the back of our plastic keyless, we have a brass screw for our power, our ungrounded conductor, and our silver screws are for our grounded conductor, our white wire, our neutral. And they take a green Robertson screwdriver. Again, I always like to put my bonds, which we don't have to worry about a bond here because our conduits are bond. And then I like to do my neutrals and then my power wires. I always like to do that in that order when I'm connecting up any device or any piece of equipment. And there it is, it's connected up. My switch is connected up. Now I'm going to do my panel. One of the things that we find very hard in this trade when we're doing the panels here is with the stranded wire. It's not like the solid wire where we can shape it and get it tight into the corners of the panel nice and neat. It makes it very difficult. Sometimes we'll use some type of straps and stuff in the panels to keep them nice and neat. It's just if we do put tie wraps or anything around there to hold these wires in, when you get a bunch of wires in there, you don't want to turn those tie wraps too tight because we're going to cause a heat problem inside our panel. It's really not a good idea to do it, but if you need to do that to neaten it up a little bit, I see it happen sometimes in the trade. But again, they don't stay nice and neat in the corners like you would like them to most of the time. We can try. And again, I like to do my neutrals first. Red Robertson screwdriver. Snug it up. Again, make sure you don't strip it too long, just enough so you can see a little bit of the copper of your conductor sticking out on both sides of the lug, and it should be good. And then we can put our breaker in. So again, our 15 amp breaker, we have our little hooks on the back side of the breaker that's going to connect into our plastic piece on our panel, and they just slide on. We're going to take our conductor, put it onto our breaker. And again, sometimes to hold these wires in here, we would have to use something to fasten them in. Once you're this far on your lab, then you need to get your instructor to come over and have a look at it, and then he's going to tell you to put it together. Then you can use your 632 screws to put your single pole switch in. Again, the single pole switch, if you keep your terminal screws to the right, it's going to be in the right direction for your on and your off. When you're putting your octagon box in, or your plastic keyless into your octagon, just give those wires just a little turn, just twist it in until you kind of curl them into the back of the box and then fasten them up. And then put your cover on your panel, and then you can test your circuit out.